Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to The Bunker. It's time to take a look at part 3 of the 151st Gilead graduation. Gilead schools, as I've explained many times, happen twice a year. They are an elite training course designed for full-time servants of Jehovah's Witnesses, typically staff members from the various branch or country facilities of Jehovah's Witnesses around the world. The graduation, I've been covering parts 1 and 2, has been interesting. It gives a bit of an insight into the teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses, and we're going to see that part 3 is no different. There are a few things I wanted to comment on, so without further ado, let's roll the first clip.
Insight on the Scriptures tells us that humility includes the ability to show mercy and compassion to others. The ability to show mercy and compassion to others. The ability to make exceptions where that is warranted. Well, that's Jehovah, isn't it? Jehovah isn't rigid. Jehovah knows when to make exceptions. How often did you read in the Bible as you went through Jehovah reconsidered? Jehovah makes perfect rules, and yet at times he reconsiders. Now let's illustrate. The Israelites are getting ready to conquer the Promised Land, and the first up is the city of Jericho. Now there's a rule of engagement, and it's very clear. Jehovah says, you must not make any covenant with them or show them any favor. No covenant, no favor. That's the rule. It's a perfect rule because it's Jehovah's rule.
We're watching governing body member David Splane speaking at the 151st Gilead graduation. David Splane's talk was fascinating for me. This part in particular, where he speaks about Jericho, you'll notice David Splane is talking about rules versus exceptions. And we're learning that Jehovah isn't rigid. Jehovah knows when to make an exception.
Jehovah isn't rigid. Jehovah knows when to make exceptions.
You can see where I'm going with this. If Jehovah isn't rigid, if Jehovah knows when to make exceptions when it comes to his perfect rules, why doesn't he make exceptions when it comes to life or death medical decisions involving blood transfusions? This was at the back of my mind throughout this part of David Splane's talk. And this particular issue of blood transfusions becomes more and more conspicuous as he continues, as we're going to see. But before we go further in the talk, I did just want to flag the issue of Bible archaeology and Jericho, because when David Splane started talking about Jericho and the siege of Jericho as recorded in the Old Testament, it reminded me of what I read in the book The Bible Unearthed. And here is said book. I've referred to it a number of times on this channel because it's absolutely fascinating, written by Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman, renowned archaeologists. And one of the fascinating things when you delve into Bible archaeology is that, well, first of all, none of the events surrounding the patriarchs as recorded in the Old Testament can be backed up by secular history or Bible archaeology. Even the conquest of the Promised Land, the supposed conquest of the Promised Land, there's there is no archaeological support for it, including Jericho. And I'm going to read to you from pages 81 and 82 under the heading, Did the Trumpets Really Blast? Just to give you a scholarly take on the narrative that David Splane is about to appeal to in his rules versus exceptions part of his talk. Did the trumpets really blast? In the midst of the euphoria, almost at the very moment when it seemed that the battle of the conquest was won for Joshua, some troubling contradictions emerged. The writer here is referring to a number of discoveries that were made that seemed to back up the Bible narrative. Even as the world press was reporting that Joshua's conquest had been confirmed, many of the most important pieces of the archaeological puzzle simply did not fit. Jericho was among the most important. As we have noted, the cities of Canaan were unfortified and there were no walls that could have come tumbling down. In the case of Jericho, there was no trace of a settlement of any kind in the 13th century BCE, and the earlier Late Bronze settlement, dating to the 14th century BCE, was small and poor, almost insignificant and unfortified. There was also no sign of a destruction. Thus, the famous scene of the Israelite forces marching around the walled town with the Ark of the Covenant, causing Jericho's mighty walls to collapse by the blowing of their war trumpets, was, to put it simply, a romantic mirage. Now, you could, if you're a believer in the Bible, sneer at this and say, what do they know? These are just men. If the Bible says that the Israelites marched around Jericho and the walls fell down, I'm going to believe the Bible. Well, these are men who have devoted their careers to understanding the Bible and where it comes from and ancient history and the extent to which archaeology and the Bible intertwine. There's simply no incentive for them to lie. And in some cases, archaeologists have combed through parts of Palestine, desperate to find evidence supporting a divine claim to that contested region. Because let's face it, it's a political hotbed, isn't it? It's a place where everyone's jostling to claim that there is some divine mandate for their particular people. I'm referring, of course, to Muslims versus Jews. The Palestinian state should be a state, in my opinion, versus Israel, which is basically occupying Palestine. There's a huge incentive for either side, really, to be able to uncover firm evidence supporting religious claims to the region. But in the case of the Old Testament and, the claims of Israelite heritage, of God having, a people who arrived from Egypt and conquered the Promised Land, no evidence has been found. And we can include Jericho in that. Now, I will just add a caveat. When you research Jericho on Wikipedia, I keep talking about Wikipedia because it is useful to just get at least some third-party objective information on certain topics. The Wikipedia article on Jericho seems to have been a little bit defaced with alternative viewpoints that don't necessarily say, oh, the Bible version is true. But when I did some digging on this, it seems that there are disagreements between scholars as to what we can categorically say regarding Jericho and its destruction. Because at some point in the history of Jericho, there were fortifications. It's just that in the case of the Bible Unearthed, which in my view is a very authoritative source, these fortifications weren't around in the period in question. So I just wanted to caveat the information I'm giving you as much as possible. Now let's press on with David Splane's talk.
Well, Rahab decides that she's going to hide the spies, but she has a condition. And if you'd like to turn to Joshua, chapter 2, we'll see what that condition was. And here's what she says in verse 13. You must spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and you must save us from death. What's she asking for? She's asking for an exception. There's a rule. You must not make any covenant with them. You must not show them any favor. And she's asking for an exception, and quite a broad exception. She's asking not just for her own life, but for the lives of all of her family members as well. Some might have thought that she was pushing it. But she asked for that, and the spies showed favor to Rahab. They made an exception, and they promised that when the time came, Rahab and her family would be spared. The Bible doesn't criticize the spies for making that exception. So it may be that Jehovah had something to do with it. Maybe Jehovah moved the spies in that direction. Maybe Jehovah saw something in Rahab that he wanted to save. Now later on, Joshua and the elders, they didn't follow instructions, and they made a covenant with the Gibeonites, and the Bible does mention that, but it doesn't mention this when it comes to the spies here. They made the exception, and we do know that Jehovah agreed with that exception. How do we know that? Because when he made the walls of Jericho fall, he preserved the section of the wall where Rahab's family lived. Jehovah agreed to an exception to his perfect rule. Now you know where I'm going with this. We need rules. And most of the time, a rule will satisfy our needs. But in a few cases, it only makes sense to make an exception to the rule.
In a few cases, it only makes sense to make an exception to the rule. Again, why does this logic not apply to Jehovah's Witnesses and blood transfusions? We're literally talking here about a scenario where a woman and her family have their life spared, and an exception is made on their behalf so that they can live. That's the point of the exception, to save lives. So if God's all about making exceptions to save certain people's lives, why is he not doing the same thing when it comes to blood transfusions? Why is God so rigid as to say you're not allowed to have blood transfusions even if refusing a blood transfusion results in your death?
I'm reminded of the time not too long ago when the Bethel family moved out of Brooklyn. Now, there were a lot of Bethelites in the congregations who were elders and ministerial servants, and so a massive reorganization of congregations was necessary in New York City. And the elders and the circuit overseers had to make sure that each congregation had a balanced number of elders, ministerial servants, and publishers. And so publishers were assigned to various congregations. Can you imagine hundreds of thousands of assignments that had to be made? And so there was a rule, and it was a pretty good rule, and the rule was, go where you're assigned. We don't have time to consider the personal feelings about every publisher in New York City, so please go where you're assigned. That was the rule. Now, there were two sisters, single sisters, who were assigned to a congregation. They didn't have a car, And you couldn't reach the congregation they were assigned to by public transportation. And so they were going to have to walk to the Kingdom Hall. And the area where the Kingdom Hall was located was very dangerous. Their safety would have been involved. Well, you had a rule. Go where you're assigned. But the circuit overseer lovingly made an exception. So the point is, we do need rules. And most of the time, our rules, even our imperfect rules, will serve most of the brothers. But let's use common sense. And there are times when we have to consider an exception.
Let's use common sense. There are times when we need to make an exception. Case in point, two sisters have to walk through a rough neighborhood. Their very lives are at risk, it seems, by being assigned to a certain congregation. And what David Splane's referring to here, of course, is the relocation of world headquarters from Brooklyn to Warwick. In world headquarters, you have hundreds of Bethelites. And when world headquarters was in Brooklyn, these Bethelites were attending congregations in parts of New York City. And so you would have, in some cases, congregations that were almost entirely composed of Bethelites. So when all of these Bethelites suddenly get relocated from Brooklyn to Warwick, it requires a massive reorganization of the congregations, as has been described here. So that there had to be this rule, apparently, where if you get assigned to a particular congregation, you just have to go with it. No saying, oh, well, I'd rather go to this congregation because my Auntie Nora's in that congregation. I'd rather be with my Auntie Nora. None of that stuff. You just have to go with your assignment. But these two sisters had a very justifiable reason to say, hang on a minute, our safety is on the line here. Please, can we have an exception? Well, why can't this same logic be used, not just in the case of blood transfusions, but if you think about it, the shunning command, the punitive ostracism that is applied to those who are disfellowshipped or disassociated, even to the extent of requiring family members to shun such ones. This can create incredible trauma, incredible emotional stress for the person who's being shunned, to the point where there are cases where such ones have been driven to suicide. So there again you have a life or death matter, where the rules that are made by Jehovah's Witnesses, by, let's be clear, David Splane and his pals, have life or death consequences, literally can lead to the death of someone, whether it's through someone refusing a blood transfusion or someone being shunned and being driven to suicide. And yet David Splane has the gall to lecture Gilead graduates on being reasonable, on making exceptions, on extending mercy. I'm not buying it, David Splane. If you really believe what you're preaching, why don't you practice it?
Jehovah directed that 7 nations in Canaan were to be eliminated. And the Gibeonites were among them, but they had a plan. They pretended to be from a far-off nation that wasn't slated for destruction. And so the elders, not consulting Jehovah, they made a vow that the Gibeonites would be spared. They made a covenant with the Gibeonites. Well, it wasn't long, but what the Israelites realized, they'd been tricked. But even though their oath had been obtained under false pretenses, they agreed to keep their word. But it's what happens next that's interesting. 5 kings of the Amorites find out that the Israelites and the Gibeonites have made a covenant, and they are furious. And so they are determined to kill all the Gibeonites, which was really what Jehovah had intended in the first place.
How charming. Jehovah intended all along for the Gibeonites to all be killed. Men, women, children, babies. If you were a Gibeonite, if you were unfortunate enough to be born into a particular nation, you were slated for destruction. That's how David Splane casually puts it. You were due to be eliminated. Another word he uses. Am I the only one, or is David Splane revealing a very disturbing streak to his character in how casually he talks about genocide, as though this is all perfectly normal, perfectly logical and acceptable? Oh, makes perfect sense that all of these nations should be slated for destruction. And hey, now there's this situation where one of these nations makes a deal under false pretenses, and another of the nations decides to fight them and do God's dirty work for him. Does he not hear the words coming out of his mouth? This, for me, again hints at a very disturbing side to David Splane's psychology. If he is so casual about the thought of entire nations being slaughtered.
What did Jehovah do? He could have said, well, that solves your problem. You promised the Gibeonites that you wouldn't put them to death, so you can sit back and let the Amorites do the job. But what did Jehovah do? Joshua chapter 10 and verse 8. Jehovah then said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, for I have handed them over to you. Not one of them will be able to stand against you." Imagine the humility. Jehovah helps the Israelites to keep a promise they had no business making. That is humility.
Yes, that's the lesson I take from this Bible verse, the humility of God. He's such a great, merciful, humble God for making alternative arrangements so that the 5 kings who were going to destroy the Gibeonites would themselves be destroyed. I'm sorry, I'm just not impressed, David Splane. I'm not impressed with anything about this Bible verse. Unfortunately, as I've already expressed, there's no reason to take any of this seriously. There's no reason to feel sorry for any of these nations that were slated for destruction, any of these men, women, children, babies who were supposedly slaughtered or whose fathers were slaughtered in warfare. Because according to archaeologists, none of this actually happened. But even if it did happen, what does it teach us about God if his solution, when he is in control of human developments, he has at his disposal a nation that he can manipulate, that he can rule over and administer and give perfect laws to and guide in some way. And the best way he can come up with to run this nation, to relocate it from one part of planet Earth to another part of planet Earth, involves bloodshed and slaughter. I don't see any special humility in any of this narrative. And isn't it odd to see someone like David Splane, who believes himself to be one of 8 individuals on the planet who speaks for God, lecturing a class of Gilead graduates about the need to be humble?
Well, let's talk about Jesus' apostles. We can really learn humility from them as well. Now, we often talk about the disputes they had, but mostly that was before Pentecost, When you think about it, after Pentecost, it was a different story. What do we find about the apostles after Pentecost? Well, they weren't interested in taking credit for things, and they weren't searching for the limelight. They were really very self-effacing, the apostles. Matthew wrote the first inspired book, the first inspired history of Jesus Christ. Do we see Matthew's picture on every other page? Matthew giving a public talk. Matthew performing a miracle. Matthew shepherding. No. His name is only mentioned twice in the whole gospel. And both times, he describes himself as a tax collector, not a very flattering portrayal. And what about the Apostle John? The name John appears 23 times in his gospel, but it never refers to the Apostle John. It almost always refers to John the Baptist.
We're watching governing body member David Splane speaking at the 151st Gilead graduation, and here is yet another example of a governing body member showing everyone how ignorant they are when it comes to Bible scholarship. I've already discussed the issue of Jericho and the fact that Bible archaeology or archaeology in the Bible lands doesn't support the conquest of Canaan led by Joseph. There isn't evidence for the Israelites wandering through the wilderness either. And yet Bible literalists like David Splane just take everything at face value. Well, that's taking the Bible itself at face value, or taking as literal what's written in the Bible. What's not written in the Bible is that Matthew was written by Matthew, Mark was written by Mark, Luke was written by Luke, John was written by John. Nowhere in those books does it indicate who wrote them. And nowhere does it say in what order were the books written. Surely, even if you're watching this as a Jehovah's Witness, you can understand that it's extremely naive to just assume that because books have been ordered in a particular canonical order, that must mean they were written in that order chronologically. That's not how it works. And when we're talking about the book of Matthew, what David Splane says here is just wrong.
Matthew wrote the first inspired book, the first inspired history of Jesus Christ.
No, he didn't. I'm sorry, this is just common knowledge. You know, one of the really satisfying things about freeing yourself from fundamentalist thinking, from having your knowledge of the Bible spoon-fed to you by charlatans like David Splane, is you get to actually pick up books written by people who know their stuff and learn what the Bible really says, what its true message is, what its intentions are, when it was written, who it was written by, etc. Now, one such book, I've already introduced you to this publication, The Bible Unearthed, and I can't recommend it enough. Another book in my collection is this one, which is fairly recent, A History of the Bible, the Book and Its Faiths by John Barton. And I would just add, John Barton is a believer. He's a Christian. So he's writing about the Bible from the perspective of someone who believes on some level that it's an inspired sacred text. Here's what John Barton has to say on page 199 under the heading, When, Where, and for Whom Were the Gospels Written? If all this gives the impression that we know less for certain about the synoptic Gospels than we should like, that is no more than the truth. Despite centuries of research, they remain an enigma, and those who revere them should be aware of how much we do not know about their composition. Further important issues are when and where they were written. A significant detail for the dates is the reference in Mark 13, verse 14, to the desolating sacrilege standing in the temple where it ought not to be. This is universally taken to be a reference to the Roman occupation of the temple in Jerusalem, and implies that even Mark, the earliest gospel, cannot have been written much before 70 CE when the temple was stormed, even if he foresaw this by a few years. Matthew and Luke definitely seem aware of the Roman sack of Jerusalem in 70. Luke speaks of Jerusalem surrounded by armies, Luke 21 verse 20, and so must have been composed later. What is more, there is no evidence that Luke's gospel was known in the early 2nd century. Traditionally, Luke has been dated to approximately the same period as Matthew, because if he wrote much later, it would be odd for him not to show knowledge of Matthew, which according to the Q hypothesis, he does not. Q is an original text that the synoptic gospel writers used that since has been lost to the sands of time. No one has the original Q text that was used as a reference by the gospel writers, whoever they were. If there was no Q, then Luke could be dated considerably later than Matthew, and Luke Acts could be a 2nd century work. But on any hypothesis, even Mark was written at least some 20 years later than the final letters of Paul. I've read on a bit there, beyond the part where it clearly says that Mark was the first gospel, not Matthew, as David Splane asserts here. Just to give you a flavour of the sort of information that is at your fingertips about the Bible, if you're willing to do the digging, if you're willing to have your beliefs challenged by knowledge that has come to us through the hard work and dedication of scholars like John Barton, Israel Finkelstein, Neil Asher Silberman, and so on. People who just want to know where the Bible comes from, how it was written, who it was written by. And these are important questions to get to the bottom of. And we simply cannot rely on the stab-in-the-dark knowledge of David Splane, his overly simplistic view that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written in that chronological order by people called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. As John Barton alludes to in just that passage that I've read, we just don't know who wrote these books. It doesn't say anywhere in them who wrote them. There are no clues as to who wrote them. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John are assigned names. They are names that have been handed to the books, titles given to these books, not the names of the authors. So it's incredibly infuriating to watch someone like David Splane, who projects, in my view, so much arrogance and so much confidence, when, in my view, his arrogance and confidence is entirely misplaced, especially when you see, just by him talking, how little he truly knows about the Bible.
When the apostles and older men met to consider the matter of circumcision, was that an important meeting? Would you agree that that was a landmark meeting? The apostles and older men are there. Who presided? Which of the 12 was jockeying for position? James, the brother of Jesus. No, he wasn't even an apostle. He's the one who presided. And then later on, when the decision was made, who announced the decision? Again, James. You don't find Peter or John saying, well, this is a pretty important decision. We think that one of us should announce it. The apostles had learned their lesson. Well, remember that when the circuit overseer visits. Now, you may have heavy responsibilities at Bethel, but when he visits a congregation, he's in charge that week. Follow his direction. Don't be critical of the circuit overseer. And don't be afraid to let him know how much you appreciate his service. And you know, our Bethel families here in the United States are such a wonderful example of that. When the circuit overseers first visit a Bethel congregation, they're a little bit nervous for about 10 minutes. But the Bethel family shows that they appreciate so much the counsel. And sometimes they talk about the circuit overseer's counsel for weeks after his visit. They really deeply appreciate the visit of the circuit overseer, and they respect that man. And we know that you're going to do the same.
Governing body member David Splane is here addressing graduates of the 151st Gilead, reminding them to honour the circuit overseer, to do what he says. He's in charge during the week of his visit. In case you don't know, circuit overseers visit congregations of Jehovah's Witnesses twice in a 12-month period. They are essentially representatives of the organization, of the governing body, you might say. And their role is to make sure that congregations are conforming to what's expected of them. If they weren't to visit, if congregations were to be left to their own devices, you can imagine a situation where congregations would just spiral off and do their own thing and perhaps have their own policies, their own teachings. So it's very much about conformity, about making sure all Jehovah's Witnesses everywhere are believing and doing the same thing. But what's interesting is the verse David Splane is referring to, he's not just talking really about the authority of circuit overseers, he is reminding Gilead graduates of the authority of the governing body, which supposedly derives from a verse in Acts chapter 15, where there is the famous debate about circumcision. Jehovah's Witnesses point to this innocuous verse as evidence that there was a governing body in Bible times, even though, as I've already explained on this channel, the phrase governing body can be found nowhere in the Bible, and it's in fact a corporate term that started to be used by Jehovah's Witnesses in the 1940s onwards. So what's happened is, rather than the Bible talking about something, the organization has come up with this idea that the governing body are sort of akin to the apostles, and they've gone retroactively looking in the Bible for some kind of verse that can prop up this idea. In fact, when you go on jw.org, to the article, What is the Governing Body of Jehovah's Witnesses? Perhaps Tibor can show said article. You'll see there a little way down, it says the governing body follows the pattern set by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem in the 1st century, who made important decisions on behalf of the entire Christian congregation. And then it gives you Acts 15, verse 2. Important decisions in the plural. Well, there's only one important decision mentioned in said verse, and it's to do with circumcision. Now, when you go to Acts chapter 15, you find something interesting that's alluded to even by David Splane, something that debunks the entire concept of this group of individuals being a governing body. A governing body, by definition, needs to be an exclusive group. It needs to be a group of individuals that can't be added to by just about anybody. It shouldn't be possible for just about anyone to join in on a governing body meeting. If the way the governing body operates now is the way it operated during this landmark moment where circumcision was being discussed, it should have been just the apostles and elders, shouldn't it? So the apostles, and when we say apostles, we mean the 12 apostles, and the elders in Jerusalem. That's not what's described. David Splane has already alluded to the fact that someone who was heavily involved in the meeting was not one of the 12.
James, the brother of Jesus, he wasn't even an apostle. He's the one who presided.
Let's make a list, shall we, of all the individuals involved in this meeting, and let's see whether it's just the apostles and older men. I'm going to give you all of the individuals described in Acts chapter 15. So there is the apostles, or the 12. There are the elders in Jerusalem. So it can't just be any elder from any part of the Mediterranean. It has to be an elder in Jerusalem. There is James, who was not of the 12, as David Splane has said there. There is Paul, who is not of the 12. He was involved in the meeting. There is Barnabas, who was not of the 12. He is also involved in the meeting. The verse describes Paul and Barnabas going down to Jerusalem with some of the others, which we can only assume were some of the others from the congregation in Antioch. They're described as going to Jerusalem and attending this meeting. So it's a crowd. It's not an exclusive group of people. It's not just the apostles and elders. It's people who are not elders in Jerusalem and who are not of the 12, all gathering together and reaching a decision. This is not describing an exclusive club of men who have, number one, reached a decision, and number two, continued to reach decisions that everyone must act upon. It's interesting, actually, when you read Acts 15, verse 22, it says, "Then the apostles and the elders, together with the whole congregation, decided to send chosen men from among them to Antioch." So even in Acts chapter 15, it debunks this notion of a central ruling governing body, an exclusive group of men who all by themselves make decisions. Even in Acts chapter 15, it's saying, no, it was the apostles, the elders, and the congregation, which we can take to mean all of these other individuals who show up, including people from Antioch, Paul, Barnabas, James, etc. So I just find it fascinating. Quite aside from all of this, you must listen to what the circuit overseer tells you. Quite apart from all that cultiness, I find it fascinating that David Splane invokes Acts chapter 15, peddling this myth that it supports the governing body arrangement, and in so doing cannot help but provide clues that the verse in question does no such thing.
Humble people are happy to contribute to the kingdom work any way they can, just so they can contribute. They're not hung up on privileges. They're not hung up on prestige or on position. They don't seek the limelight. And in this regard, we're going to talk a little bit about the Apostle Paul. Now, Brother Lippold mentioned in his talk that Paul was not a man to boast. And that's quite true. Actually, Paul was a very humble man. Now think about this. At the time Paul was converted, about 34 CE, Jesus told Ananias that Paul was going to have a wonderful privilege. Let's read about it. Acts chapter 9, Acts 9 and 15. And this is Jesus to Ananias. But the Lord said to him, "Go, because this man is a chosen vessel to me, to bear my name to the nations, as well as to kings and to the sons of Israel." A chosen vessel. How about that? How did Paul react? Did he let that go to his head? Did he immediately go up to Jerusalem and volunteer to be on the governing body, saying, well, now that I'm anointed, I can be on the governing body? No, he stayed where he was in Damascus, and he kept preaching the good news. Now, in 36 CE, he did go up to world headquarters in Jerusalem. And how did he react? Did he say, here I am, the chosen vessel. I'm here to help you run the place? He stayed with the Apostle Peter for a couple of weeks. Apparently, Peter had moved to Jerusalem. But he kept preaching. He just put his head to the ground and he kept preaching the good news until one day Jesus appeared to him when Paul was in the temple. And he told Paul that he had to leave Jerusalem immediately because the Jews were out to kill him.
As we've discussed, governing body member David Splane is here addressing Gilead graduates, and it seems that the main thrust of his talk is to impress upon them the need for humility. And in making this appeal, he's dipping into the New Testament, particularly stories from the book of Acts, to talk about the attitude of the Apostle Paul, who, again, was not one of the 12, and yet arguably had far more influence on what we now perceive as Christianity than any individual who was on the 12. I mean, just think about it. Think of all the letters, the epistles that are in the New Testament. Think of the wall of text that this individual supposedly contributed to the Bible compared to the individuals or even the 12 collectively. The writings of Paul far outweigh what the apostles, what the 12 actually contributed. And here in David Splane's summary of Paul, he's describing Paul, or alluding to the fact that Paul was considered a chosen vessel. So Paul had a special position that had nothing to do with the apostles, nothing to do with the older men. He got to do his own thing. And indeed, when you read the book of Acts, it's obvious that Paul isn't receiving any directions. He's not receiving directions from, as David Splane puts it, a world headquarters in Jerusalem.
Now, in 36 CE, he did go up to world headquarters in Jerusalem.
What world headquarters in Jerusalem? World headquarters? We're talking about the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is not the world. He's just so desperate to make the Bible describe his authority or the authority of the governing body, to shoehorn his narrative or the narrative of a centralized leadership into what's described in the scriptures. But the scriptures describe no such thing. You have in the scriptures a man, Paul, doing his own thing, not beholden to the apostles in Jerusalem, but rather cooperating with them and deciding for himself where he gets assigned to, deciding for himself where he needs to preach and what he needs to do. So I find it fascinating that in trying to remind Gilead graduates of the need for humility, of the need to submit to the authority of the organization. Again, David Splane, who clearly is lacking in his knowledge of the Bible, cannot help but give clues pointing to the fact that there was no governing body, there was no centralized leadership, and individuals like the Apostle Paul, a chosen vessel, could do more or less whatever they wanted.
I was thinking of the lovely interview we just heard, where the brother talked about how he eventually ended up in the circuit work, but before that time, Jehovah gave him a little training. And perhaps that's what happened to the Apostle Paul. Do you know that Paul may have remained in Tarsus for 8 years, preaching? And then Barnabas came along. 11 years after Paul's conversion, Barnabas came along and invited him to Antioch. And from that time on, Paul started to have privileges. And 5 years after that, Paul wrote his first inspired letter that we cherish to this day. Paul worked hard all his life. He did more than any of the 12 apostles, but he was never upset that he wasn't counted among them.
Well, how does that square up with the governing body arrangement today? Paul, a chosen vessel, does more than any of the other apostles. He writes the majority of the New Testament, and yet he's not a governing body member. It just doesn't make any sense. If we were to see this replicated today, then Christopher Kitts would be the star of Jehovah's Witness leadership, and he would be mentioned in the same breath as the governing body. In fact, we would be hearing more about Christopher Kitts than we hear about David Splane, Stephen Lett, Tony Morris, and so on. And I found it interesting that David Splane referred to Christopher Kitts and the claim that Christopher Kitts made earlier on in the graduation about having been trained by Jehovah.
That experience was amazing because that's where Jehovah gave me my training.
So this guy, Christopher Kitts, makes this claim about Jehovah being his mate and providing him personal training. And David Splane just takes his word for it. Oh, well, Christopher said that he was trained by Jehovah. That must have happened. Why would Christopher Kitts brag about something like that? Why would he just make that up? You know, he'd have to be deluded or something, and clearly he's a sane, rational, humble individual. So David Splane just accepts that Christopher Kitts was personally trained by God and says, well, that's what it must have been like for the Apostle Paul. Well, again, David Splane, if you're drawing this comparison, if you're saying that the way things were in first century Christianity is the way things are now, then why aren't we seeing Christopher Kitts hosting JW Broadcasting? Why aren't we seeing him writing books and providing spiritual food all by himself, which is what he would need to do if the model that's described in Acts and in the New Testament were to be applied to the modern day?
Well, when you go to your assignments, many situations are going to test your humility. And I know that you brothers and sisters are going to pass the test. The branch asks you to work on a project. And deep down, you don't quite agree with it. Deep down, you really wonder if it's going to work. And you wonder if it's not going to be a waste of your time. But you're not going to put it on the back burner and say, well, I'll get to it someday if I get time. You're not going to do that. You're going to put heart and soul into the project. You're going to pray to Jehovah to bless the project that you didn't quite agree with. Or If you're asked to make a recommendation and you favor one option over another, humility is going to move you to present all of the options, all of the pros and cons equally. You're not going to slant things, thinking, well, I'm going to have to help these brothers to make this decision, so I'll put a really heavy weight on the pros and I'm going to make it really light on the cons. Don't do that. I know that you're going to present everything honestly, and you're going to recognize that it's the Holy Spirit that helps brothers to make decisions. Trust the Spirit to move the brothers to do the right thing.
Use the Force, Gilead graduates. Follow the leanings of the Holy Spirit and let the Holy Spirit guide you, is the message from David Splane in the 151st Gilead graduation. I couldn't help but watch this and just be amazed at how overt and blatant the control is here. David Splane, as much as saying, you may not agree with it, you may think it's a total waste of time, but support it anyway. If you're asked to do something by the organization, make it happen, make it work. Pray for God's Holy Spirit, be supportive, even if you think it's a bad idea. Isn't that exactly the sort of thinking that's required in any abusive group where people are asked to do things they wouldn't naturally do, including such things as promote the martyrdom of people in medical situations through the refusal of blood transfusions and the covering up of abuse? If you can persuade people that obedience in and of itself is the sole factor, no matter what your personal feelings may be, you can persuade people to do more or less anything.
Suppose you sisters are working on a team, or you brothers are working on a body of elders. I know that not even in your heart of hearts, you're going to think that you have the best judgment on the team, and that, well, you can listen politely to the expressions of others, but really, yours is the only sensible conclusion, and we hope that the brothers and sisters are going to go along with us. You're not going to think that, because nobody's right all the time. Jehovah's Spirit can work on any member of the team. Don't get discouraged if every suggestion you make in a meeting gets shot down. It happens to the best of us. And there will be other meetings, and hopefully some of them will go better for you. Don't get discouraged. And don't decide, well, I'm not going to say anything anymore. I'm not going to contribute anymore. Be humble and recognize that at times we may make suggestions that don't make very much sense. I certainly appreciate the kind way the governing body deals with me with some of my lame-brain suggestions.
Can you elaborate, David Splane? Can you give us some examples of suggestions of yours that have been shot down by the rest of the governing body for being silly? I'd love to know exactly what he's referring to. Of course, he's never going to say, he's never going to give any actual examples. If you ask me, this part on the end was just meant to feign self-deprecation and remind the graduates of his position. One thing I've noticed governing body members like to do is weave into their talks occasionally reminders of the fact that they are governing body members. And that's a perfect example in my mind of him just saying something that alludes to his power, alludes to his position. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe David Splane is humble after all, but that's what I'm seeing there. And I also find it very interesting that in these concluding remarks in David Splane's talk, David Splane is using very interesting language. He's not just saying, do this, do that, or don't do this. He's saying things like, I know you won't do this, or you're not going to do this, which for me is just a bit more coercive. It's not just about whether something's right or wrong. It's about living up to his personal expectations. I know, David Splane, that you would never do this. And the idea being, of course, that Gilead graduates don't want to disappoint him, don't want to fail him in any way, because he's David Splane, he's a governing body member.
You may know that back in 2011, the governing body adjusted the objective of Gilead school training a bit. Now the training is even more focused on strengthening and stabilizing the field and branch organization. Since that time, a good number of graduates have been appointed to a branch or a country committee, and so with Jehovah's blessing, the training is working. But not all graduates from Gilead are brothers who may someday receive such responsibilities. We have many sisters in each class too, don't we? So then how might the goal of strengthening and stabilizing the field and branch organization be reached through each one of you graduating brothers and sisters? Well, the goal is reached when others can look at what you do and say, and they see a man or woman of strong faith. The devil wants nothing more than to see us neglect our faith, because that will pull everything down if he can do that. We show that we're strengthening our faith in God when we take time to give attention to our spiritual needs. The basics always count. The basics always count. So then be certain to regularly attend Christian meetings, which we know you'll do, and soon in person, right? To zealously speak to others about Jehovah's name and his kingdom, to maintain strong faith by reading God's word every day, and then to apply its counsel prayerfully in all that you do. Those are the basics that never fail us and help us to keep our faith strong.
We're watching governing body member Kenneth Cook delivering his concluding remarks at the 151st Gilead graduation. Two things really stood out here. You'll have seen him referring to the basics. Kenneth Cook is apparently terrified of the prospect of Gilead graduates being influenced by Satan. And in order to hold on to their faith, the basics always count. And the basics are, number one on the list, attending meetings, preaching, reading the Bible every day, and praying. So that's apparently going to keep Satan at bay if you can do all of those things. And I would agree, if you completely immerse yourself in the Jehovah's Witness religion, if you plug yourself in to the constant flow of indoctrination at the meetings in particular, you don't really have time to question your beliefs. You're so busy on the Jehovah's Witness hamster wheel, just trying to keep up with what's expected of you. Where do you have the time to just think about things? Because in my view, and maybe you'll agree, Jehovah's Witness beliefs unravel with minimal scrutiny just by thinking about them, just by thinking about what they really imply. The destruction of everybody on our planet who's not a Jehovah's Witness, billions of men, women, and children dying because they have committed the crime of not following Kenneth Cook and his pals or recognizing their authority. Really? That's what we're supposed to believe is God's master plan? So yes, of course, Kenneth Cook wants Gilead graduates in particular, who are charged with stabilizing and strengthening the organization, to stay faithful. And it's also interesting that he sort of acknowledges the fact that not all of the Gilead graduates will be able to contribute in the same way.
But not all graduates from Gilead are brothers who may someday receive such responsibilities. We have many sisters in each class too, don't we?
Yeah, we do. We do have many sisters in each Gilead class. And of course, in the Jehovah's Witness religion, women are treated as practically second-class citizens. If you're a woman, you'll only ever get on the platform at a Jehovah's Witness event, whether it's a Kingdom Hall meeting or an assembly or a convention, if you are, number one, cleaning the platform, or number two, giving a demonstration or an experience under the direction of a brother. That's how women are treated in the Jehovah's Witness religion, and yet here they are being allowed to partake of the Gilead training and indeed graduate. So why? What's the point of training them? What's the point of filling their heads with all of this information if they're not really allowed to use it? The solution is...
Well, the goal is reached when others can look at what you do and say, and they see a man or woman of strong faith.
Yeah, don't worry, ladies, if you're not being used. Don't worry if you have to just sit there in the audience while your husband uses all of this knowledge that he's gained at Gilead on the platform. You still get to set an example of Christian faith. Well, doesn't that apply to everybody? Doesn't that apply to every single Jehovah's Witness, whether you're a governing body member, an elder, a circuit overseer, a pioneer, an unbaptized publisher? Doesn't every Christian get to set an example in their own way? I think what Kenneth Cook is doing here is just offering some kind of excuse when the real reason, in my view, for training these women is because they are the wives of important men in the organization, and they want these husband and wife teams to stay together and be on the same page regarding what the organization expects. They can't really do that if they only train the man and if the woman is left in the dark. So they allow both to receive the training and both to graduate and both to feel important, even though it's only the guy who really gets to use the knowledge he receives. Anyway, that's all I have for you. Those were my thoughts on the 151st Gilead graduation, all 3 parts. We got there eventually. Now I can finally turn my attention to the 2022 Pursue Peace Convention. Yes, I've been seeing your comments. I've been seeing the questions. When are you going to comment on Stephen Lett referring to babies as enemies of God? Yes, it's in my pending tray. I just really feel strongly about following the flow of indoctrination that Jehovah's Witnesses get fed. And I'm aware that the Gilead graduation doesn't rank very high on most Jehovah's Witnesses' radar when it comes to spiritual food, but it nonetheless, I think, has given some very interesting insights into the mind of the governing body and their weaknesses, for example, when it comes to knowledge of the Bible. So hopefully you understand why I stick to this regimented system of going through one at a time each of these releases of videos. And next on my list is the 2022 Pursue Peace Convention. I will get straight on it. Please do tune in for it in the coming days. So that's all I have for you. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lloyd Evans channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you for watching.
Oh,